Hi everyone, Shelly here. Join me today while I add color to my dried underpainting for 3 doves. I've used transparent oxide brown oil paint by Rembrandt for the underpainting. If you missed the process video, you can go back and check that out. You can see here on my palette that I've pre-mixed a few of my colors just to get started, but it's by no means the final mixtures that I'll be using. The oil paint palette that I'm using, you can see listed here. Titanium White by Sennelier, Yellow Brown Old Holland, Chinese Vermilion Sennelier, Indian Orange Chauverin, Ash Green by Chauverin, Warm Gray by Chauverin, Brown Ochre by Old Holland, and Mars Black by Old Holland. My main objective for color is to not let the saturation in the paints overtake the underpainting. I want to have the end result of the painting be an extremely muted, grayed down color harmony. I love seeing the orange color from the transparent oxide brown underpainting come through in certain little areas of the color that's going on top. But I do often wonder, why don't I just use a black and white or sort of a grayed underpainting, and then that would help me not be so saturated. I know I have a tendency to oversaturate, especially in the flesh tones. So I'm going to be extremely mindful of that while I am painting those areas. But right now you can see I'm starting with the sky in the background. I tend to work from back to front in my paintings, so you'll see that happening here. It's always a good idea to remind yourself of where your light source is and of the temperature of your light source. In this case, my 3 figures are placed outdoors. That means sunlight is going to be illuminating them, meaning a warm light source. So the light's coming mostly from the upper right of the scene, and to the left here we have these storm clouds, and the gray and black storminess is more on the left side of the painting, and allowing the viewer to kind of see how the warmth and sunlight is coming in from the right, and then at some point there in the middle they will converge with one another. You may have noticed there's blank spots on the far left and far right of my canvas. That is going to be covered up with actual 100-year-old barn wood, and I'm kind of picking up what that wood looks like onto the wooden fence behind the 3 figures. Okay, let's jump ahead a little bit. Here's where I'm at with the background so far. Time to paint the crow that's landed on the fence. I had the idea that this crow is kind of screaming at these girls, giving them a warning that trouble may be headed their way. My first passes of color are going to be fairly close to what I want in the end result. However, a lot of times towards the end of the painting, once everything's dry, I do feel a lot of times that I need to glaze over the whole thing just to sort of unite everything together with one final color temperature. You may have noticed that I enlarged the crow just a little bit from what the underpainting initially had it as the size. So, you know, even though you have an underpainting, it doesn't mean you're chained to what's there. You can always make, changes. Like here, we're making the crow a little bit bigger. Maybe I wanted to make it smaller. I mean, you're just always allowed that freedom to make those choices along the way. There's some lightning bolts happening there in the background by her hat. Once that's dry, then I'll go over it with some yellow glazing, and it'll give this sort of illumination that'll happen in the dark sky. I like to paint things in pretty precise and then mess it up with a fan brush or a rubber stump, whatever is handy, just anything to come along. You can always mess it up and then put details back that you felt like maybe you needed to keep but got messed up. I don't know, I just don't like painting everything super detailed and super explained. I need some areas to be soft. Just like with painting a portrait, you want a variety of edges throughout each element. Time to paint the three birds that are in the background. I wanted it to look like perhaps there's some trouble coming towards these girls, and it disturbed these birds, and they've taken flight due to being disturbed. I really like my paintings to take on a storytelling quality. However, before I tell someone the story, I would rather hear what story they see in the painting. I love it when viewers tell me the story that comes to their mind. Often it's being related to experiences they've had in their lives. And then it's always fun to hear those, but then explain to them what I had intended, but not until they tell me theirs first. Here I'm going to scumble in some of the floor and background area on the ground. I want that earthy brownish red orange element to come through in these areas. So I'm going to use this silicone squeegee. I've got another little spatula type brush that I like to use. Perhaps just some dry brushing technique on top, letting areas of that underpainting show through. The touches of green that you see being put throughout this painting have been mixed from the Mars Black, which is Old Holland, and the Yellow Brown, also Old Holland. And those colors are very brand specific. You won't get the same results from other brands, but I just extremely like the greens that you can get from mixing with black and that yellow brown. I've tried sap greens, viridian greens, other natural greens, and it's always too saturated for me, and I'm always killing it with blacks or brown anyway. So this way, when I mix it, I have better control over the degree of saturation. Because as I stated earlier, I really don't want a lot of saturation throughout this painting. So even when it's laid down, it looks more saturated here than what it is in the end result. Besides, once it's dry, more than likely I'll either sand some of it away, or I like to glaze over it with black. Again, I'm painting in more detail than I plan on keeping. I know I'm going to be scraping through some of that. Also, I noticed that boot that's wearing the spur, the foot was too short, so I did end up elongating it so it would look correct. I've learned throughout the years and from other mentors that it's better to have larger feet rather than smaller feet. So if you're erring on the side of one or the other, go larger. Same with hands, and we'll be diving in later to the hands specifically, and we'll be talking more about that then. But yeah, err on the side of larger by far. I'm going to be keeping some more transparent or thinner scumbled areas, while definitely the lighter areas are going to be thicker and more opaque. And this is going to give you a more volumetric illusion. It allows the light to push into the paint and into the surface in the transparent or thinner areas, while the thicker and more opaque areas bounce light back into the viewer's eye, and it increases the volume and the depth that you can see in the painting by utilizing that technique. So I'm often trying to remind myself, paint thin in certain areas where you want the light to kind of sink in, or that area to sink in, and then be more opaque and thick in the areas where you want things to appear closer or protruding into the viewer's eye. All right, I've got a fresh palette here. I'm going to mix some flesh tones. We're going to be starting with the hands and then moving up into the heads. So this palette is more limited. It's closer to the Apelles palette. So again, the titanium white, the yellow brown, Indian orange is just a convenience color. I could mix my orange from the vermilion and the yellow brown, but I find it just gives me, I use a lot of orange, especially in a painting this large, so I'd rather have a convenience color, and the Indian orange works great with the other colors on my palette. So here I've mixed some middle value to light value colors. Since I have a gray palette, it's about a value 5, 6 palette, I can easily judge the values of my colors against that. And if you're having trouble and you want to understand the values of your mixtures, it's always a good idea. Snap a picture with your phone, turn it to black and white, and you can easily tell the values. And I like to orient my values with the middle values in the middle, lighter values below, and then my darker values on top of that. Even though I'm pre-mixing some flesh tones, by no means is this going to be the only flesh tones that I use. I just start with these mixtures and then I continually mix brushstroke by brushstroke what I need along the way, but this just gives me a little bit of a head start. You see, I've got some yellow mixed with white. I've got some red mixed with white. So I have these light yellow, light pink piles of paint, and I use those in other mixtures. I rarely will use those colors on their own. And then I have some greens mixed because I know my flesh tones are going to need to be unsaturated. And those green piles that are lighter there will definitely help me do that. So I have to remember that my light source is the sun, which means the light opaque areas on my flesh are going to lean towards warm to neutral. And then as I move away towards the shadow, like the half tones are going to be a bit more neutral gray. And then as I get into more of the shadow colors, then I'm looking at more mauve tones. But I think the ultimate thing that I have to keep in mind here is that I don't want the temperatures to be both warm or both cool. I need that separation in the planes. So I have to constantly remind myself I'm working with, right now, warmer lights, neutral halftones, and cooler shadows. I heard Vincent Desiderio the other day on a podcast say something that I found intriguing. He said chalky paintings happen when you have cool temperatures with cool temperatures. So if you don't want chalky paintings, then separate your temperatures, have neutrals with warms, cools with warms, that kind of thing. But a lot of times you hear people worried about adding white into their mixtures that are mid-value to darker value, afraid that you're going to get a chalky result. Well, according to Vincent Desiderio, it's more about temperature rather than the white paint going into that darker mixture. The other thing that is important to me here is I really want a lot of 3D effect in these hands. The hands are my focal point, not the faces. So I want the hand, like right here, the knuckles need to be painted in a lighter, tiny bit more saturated color so it goes forward towards the viewer's eyes. And then the areas, the planes that I want to start moving back into the picture plane need to get darker, need to be more neutral, less saturated. And then as you move towards the shadows, again, that darkness and that transparency is going to allow that area to sink back in space. And it's going to really give the illusion that this hand, it's going to, hopefully, the goal is that it should feel like the viewer could just, reach out and touch a real hand, even though it has an extremely painterly look to it. There is the element of realism, but to a degree that it still looks like a painting. The other thing you'll notice here, I widened the area where the blackness of the gun between that thumb I'm painting now and the index finger is. So again, you're not a slave to the underpainting. Yeah, you put it in, you spent time on the drawing and the values, but in the ultimate end result, it needs to look correct. In painting hands, you have to think about each finger as being more like a rectangular, elongated box rather than a tubular sausage-like structure, because there is a top, a bottom, and there's a side, a left and a right side. And you have to be aware of that structure, how it connects to the palm, where does the thumb connect as opposed to where do the fingers connect, and you need to have the underlying structure drawn correctly. And then as you paint it, it makes it a little easier, if it's drawn correctly, to understand how the light's hitting and to allow you to build in that 3D effect. I've learned from my recent mentor, Sebastian Salvo, who's an odd nerdrum student, that odd nerdrum would often teach them that each finger needs to have its own personality. You don't want each finger to be painted exactly the same. You can vary little bits in temperature, in the color that's there, just how the light's hitting it. You just want to always think about each finger as its own individual portrait in a way. The other thing I wanted to keep in mind when I'm painting these hands, these girls are basically in a fight for their life. They're not going to be clean and pristine and perfectly manicured. These are hands of girls that are fighting. And I wanted them to look a little more masculine than feminine. You may have also noticed that I had the black bustier and the black, there's like a furry cowhide kind of buffalo type pants that she's wearing. And that's a lot of dark. I had that already put in before I started putting the flesh in the hands and the arms. I needed that dark area to be established in order to better gauge the value structure that I was putting into the hands and the arms. The black behind these hands and arms also pushes forward quite easily because of the strong contrast and value difference in this area. Now, technically, you would see shadow below the arms just a little bit, so I am going to be enhancing some of the lighter taupe type colors in the pants below in areas just to kind of emphasize that there is a bit of a shadow happening below the arms. Now, when we get into this figure, she's wearing a light colored bustier. So before I put the lights in, I wanted to go ahead and put in the values of the arms and the hands. It's actually my eyes seeing things kind of in the reverse manner. I can always lighten the areas by adding lighter, more opaque, but I worried that if I put the light bustier in before the flesh tones in this figure's hands and arms, that I would misjudge the values. Now, in her bustier, the area below the hands where you see the gun kind of against her, the butt of the gun there, there's going to be a shadow that I need to put in order to really give more 3D effect and push those hands forward towards the viewer, and to also increase the contrast. Because, again, my hands and the bustiers are the focal point of my painting. And I am saying focal point with an F, not with a V. I know sometimes it sounds like I'm saying it with a V, but it is FOCAL point that I'm referring to. Just a little side note. With all the hands in this painting, I am understanding that there is a strong degree of sunlight hitting them. That's going to really push the spaces between the fingers quite dark. So I am going to keep a nice sharp dark reddish brown line between the fingers. And I also want to make sure that I have a variety of edges. I want some blurred into each other, some soft, some hard, some broken. So I'm keeping that in mind. But as we said, the lighter areas are going to pop forward, while then the halftone areas start to push back, and then the shadows go back even further. I like to put down color brushstroke by brushstroke and kind of leave it alone. I don't like to do too much blending, if any blending at all. I just like to keep layering brushstrokes. If I put down a brushstroke and I don't like the placement or the color, I just go over top of it with another brushstroke, or crisscross, kind of like basket weave colorful brushstrokes into one another. But you can just keep doing it that way. I find if you blend, I don't know, I haven't blended colors in a really long time, but I think I have a memory of when I used to do that, it just never resulted in the look that I wanted anyway. So when I figured this technique suited my temperament and style of painting, it just really made everything look the way I aesthetically wanted to be painting. Now, even though she's wearing a white bustier, in order to have a really strong degree of contrast in this area, since it is the focal point, the gun being black, the bustier being white, and then the hands and arms somewhere in the middle, it's going to give me that high degree of contrast, which will attract the viewer to this area as I was wanting that to happen. So we talked about different variety of edges throughout the hands. You'll notice the middle finger at the knuckle has a nice hard edge against that half tone as it moves back onto the top part of the back of the hand. And then look at the ring finger and then look at the pinky finger where those knuckles connect. And you can see how it's a softer transition on the ring finger, and then it's more of a continuation and a lost transition at the knuckle where the pinky meets the back of the hand. So that's another way of creating sort of a unique portraiture effect, if you will, for each individual finger. And you can see how putting the black in underneath the hands and the fingers of this weapon, it really is intensifying the contrast of that area. Understanding how you can use contrast and saturation in order to guide the viewer through your painting is an ideal that I didn't really quite understand in the beginning when I was first learning to paint. But as you continue to paint and look at master paintings and look for that, then you start to really understand it and grasp it. And it's your job as a painter to learn how to manage and control it. Don't let saturation be all over in every point, every corner of your painting, and don't let contrast, high degree of strong contrast, be everywhere. You want to concentrate it into the important points or spots within your painting. So here we go, adding in the shadows over the bustier. So the sun's hitting the arms and the hands from slightly above and in front of the figure. And I have to remember that these shadows need to be neutral to cool in temperature in order for the light areas of the bustier to appear more warm in temperature due to the fact they're being illuminated by the sun, which is a warm light source. Now, this hand being an open hand on her thigh, I was initially concerned that it looked a little bit small. So I do end up painting slightly beyond what's here for the underpainting in order to enlarge or elongate the fingers somewhat. And I think it gave me the result in the end that I was looking for. So I'm going to remind you guys that these videos of the painting process you're seeing here, they are sped up. So it took probably, I think it was 2 days total to paint all 6 hands and all 3 guns. And in order to keep my paint palette fresh throughout this 2-day process, the night when I was finished painting, I would pop the palette into my freezer, being careful not to get paint on my ice trays, and then bring it out the next day about 30 minutes before I would be wanting to paint so that it could thaw out. And then my paints were just as buttery and fresh as the day I first mixed them. I am a rather slow painter, so I did speed it up in order to not bore you guys to death. This video would have been like 10 hours long, although it did take me quite a long time to paint this. It ended up being probably, with underpainting included, about a 2-month process all in all. But when I finished the first layer of color, I like to sit with it for a little while. Because the more I sit with it and look at it in different lights, I like to bring it into different rooms, take it outside, and just live with it for a minute, and then decide if there's any more editing or touch-ups that need to happen. I guess the point of my rambling there is to take your time. There are no awards for painting fast. So just really don't rush yourself. Enjoy the process and just be there in the moment and take your time with what you're doing, thinking about what's happening in front of you with the paint and the area that you're painting. A lot of times when I'm painting, especially something like hands, which I actually like painting. I know a lot of people think they're difficult and tend to not like painting hands. I love painting hands. It feels a lot like sculpting to me. I'm constantly thinking about what plane am I on, how's the light hitting this plane, and putting the brush strokes down kind of in a sort of tile mosaic pattern, if you will. Feels a lot like sculpting, only you're kind of working in reverse, I guess. Rather than removing clay as you would do when sculpting, I am building up the form by laying down the brush strokes. Okay, hands and arms have been painted for all three of my figures, and now we're moving up into the faces. So I have to keep in mind that the faces are not my focal point. I don't want to see a really highly detailed face. In fact, the eyes, due to the way that the cowboy hats are seated on their heads and the sun's hitting, it's creating the shadow across the eyes. It's almost giving this sort of Lone Ranger kind of mask effect. And I've got to remember that. So in order for the shadows to remain transparent so that the light can just zoom all the way in against the wood panel there, I have to keep that in mind. I need those areas to be painted thinly more than anything. That's the important thing here. Thin layers of paint in the shadows. Whereas when we get into a bit more where the light's hitting the face, I've got to keep those areas pretty opaque, and I can put more thick applications of paint in those areas, and that'll bounce the light back into the viewer's eye, giving me a beautiful 3D, more volumetric kind of effect. So this is the first face that I'm attempting, and I stayed clear of the shadow area around the eyes initially. I wanted to just sort of warm up and move into that area. And also I think it was helpful. So I established a little bit of the darks in the hair, and then I established some of the lights and halftones, leaving nothing left at some point here in a minute for me to move into the shadows. So yeah, I was nervous. I didn't want to mess it up because I've gotten a few days of painting going in here, and I just really was liking what was happening, and I don't know, I felt a bit nervous, so I kind of tiptoed up to that point and eventually dove in. So I'm putting in some of the darker tones here on the chest, and then I think I'm going to add in a bit more of the hat just to have a lot of the elements around those eyes already established before I move into that shadow part of the face. I don't know why I felt nervous to paint the eyes. I think it's quite silly because I often tell students that there's no fear in oil painting. You can always scrape it off or wipe it away. So paint with oils, be bold, be fearless. So here I go. I'm in the shadow zone of the eyes. And again, it's important that I keep this paint application into this area thin, somewhat neutral, or onto the cool side. So as long as I remember those elements for this point of the face, everything should be okay. I'm searching for the balance where you can just see enough of the eyes to get somewhat of an emotion from her, but not so much that it's a high degree of contrast. So I have to keep the values in this area condensed. They all need to live in the range of about 7, 6, 5, 4, nothing light, can't go too dark, can't go too light. You've got to really concentrate the values in this area so that you see just enough of her eyes, just enough, not too much. Another thing you may have noticed throughout the first run of color on this somewhat of a orangey brown underpainting, I'm using a lot of mixtures that have sort of a green undertone to them. I felt like the green would offset some of the reddish brown colors and then cancel out a lot of the saturation, because I know I tend to paint things to be a little more overly saturated than I want in my end result. So I thought that might help me combat that. So once it dries, I was looking at it, and it ended up that in a lot of the background areas it was a bit too green for my liking, so that's okay. After it dried to the touch, I just mixed some of black with a bit of walnut oil, and I glazed it over, and that helped to tone everything down. And in a couple of areas that were a bit more opaque, once I had the two pieces of wood attached to the canvas, towards the end I like to go ahead and put the wood on so that I can see how those colors play into the painting. And I went back in and touched up bits of the wood to incorporate some of the gray tones that were coming from the real wood that had been applied to the front of the painting. It really gives a nice 3D effect. It almost looks like you're stepping into this scene with these three girls. Okay, for those of you who are just meeting me for the first time, I want to let you know that I am currently employed with an online art academy, RTY Art, and you can learn more about that. And also I offer one-on-one mentoring, and you can learn more about that. All of this information is in the description below this video. So if you're interested in learning how you can work on your painting skills along with me, check that out in the description below this video. Time to move into the figure on the right's face, and I felt confident now. I'm going right into the eye area. It was a little less, intimidating for some reason, since she's looking downward and I didn't really see into her eye so much. There wasn't a lot of the white of the eye. It was more about how the light was reflecting into the outside eyelid area. And initially I had thought she would be a brunette, but as I was building up the painting and just loving the way that the underpainting looked for her hair, and I didn't want to cover it up, so she has now become somewhat of a redhead. And I really like the effect of how the hair was just sort of, basically the underpainting. In a couple areas, I made the shadow side just a little bit more opaque, and I was careful to keep it a little on the neutral/cool side in temperature in order to push it back in space. But the underpainting of her hair just worked so well, especially with the flesh tones and then the light color of her bustier, and all the kind of greenish tones in the sky and the fence behind her. I just loved it. And then I felt like it also was going to lend itself to balance the composition against this figure, seeing how she's got this fox pelt across her shoulder there. And I was thinking that might be a good way to tie those two figures together, kind of like bookends, with our central figure being there in the middle. So this one, again, I felt more confident again, even though her eye was a bit open, moving into that shadow zone. And it's funny, once you kind of get going and get warmed up, you build your confidence. But she ended up, the eyes areas worked out just fine. I was quite pleased with all three faces in the end. It turned out a lot more aesthetically pleasing than I thought initially it would. I don't know, I'm used to really getting in there and painting the details of the eyes and the face, and letting the hands take precedence over the face was a new idea for me. But I do like the end results. Hopefully you do as well. I want to thank the three models, Abby, Jordan, and Fiona, for being such great subjects for many of my paintings. I really enjoy painting these girls. I met them in South Dakota at a Fiddler's Green Western photo shoot, and what great models. They really have given me a lot of inspiration. Many paintings still to come with these girls. So this is the left figure's face that I am working on now, and I am keeping in mind that I have these neutral to coolish thin layers of shadow that I'm putting in. Her hair's tied back, so there's not going to be a lot of hair affecting how the shadows affect the skin tones. And being that it's almost a profile, you only see the tiniest bit of that far away eye, and I have to be careful not to paint it too much because I want it to push back in space, so there has to be very little detail and very little contrast in that far away eye. And again, it's in shadow, so there was a lot of control that needed to happen in that upper part of the face. But I think in the end, I was quite pleased. It all seemed to work out quite nicely. This figure also, with the head turned to the profile, you can see a good bit of the ear. Again, I have to be careful not to overdo the detail. It is in shadow, so I just need to suggest or give the impression of the ear. And then there's a couple little wispy bits of hair falling out of her braid, and the light's catching it just slightly. So again, you got to be real selective not to overdo. They're fun to put in, so you tend to want to put more highlights and things in like that than you really need to do. So less is more in this situation. I'd like to think that each painting that I do teaches me a new skill or reinforces maybe a skill that I've been wanting to try or needing to practice more with. But what I took away from this painting is that I don't have to worry too much about oversaturating, especially flesh tones, because I can rely on glazes. I did utilize a lot of glazing in this painting, more so than I have in the past. So I felt pretty comfortable knowing that, as things were getting towards completion and they were drying, I was able to come back over. And I glazed a lot with black. I don't know if people often think of black as a color that you want to glaze with, but in this case it actually worked quite well, especially because I wanted their arms and their hands to appear somewhat masculine and a little bit like, I guess dirty is a good word, not so clean and pristine and perfect. I needed these girls to look like, they've been through something and are prepared to keep fighting. So here's the end result of 3 doves. Thanks for watching. You can check out more on my website, westernsandwood.com, and be sure to look at the description below this video to learn more about how you can paint with me. See you guys in the next one.